Hey guys, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 bringing to you another edition of the Spider-Man review series, and today I thought I'd talk about another favourite episode of mine from Season 1, and this episode does get talked about, but maybe not as much as other episodes that featured the Green Goblin or Venom. But this episode is one of my favourites simply because it's a classic crime story. Very basic, nothing spectacular. It basically follows the hero who gets framed for a crime he didn't commit, and he's got to try and find a way to clear his name but also find the guy who framed him. And the episode that I'm talking about is, of course, The Menace of Mysterio. Now, I'm dedicating this review to one of my good friends who's a huge fan of Mysterio. He's one of his favourite Spider-Man villains of all time, and he's one of my favourites too, but this villain is one of his favourites, so I'm dedicating it to him. Now, the villain Mysterio is no stranger to hardcore fans, and he's been one of the main heavy hitters since making his first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man issue 13 back in 1963. And Mysterio is what you would call what's the best way you could describe Mysterio? He uses illusions, tricks, and theatricality, and his origin story was basically he was a special effects man who was able to create special effects and using all sorts of tricks and stuff. So Mysterio, in my opinion, is one of the classic Spider-Man villains, and he's been around a long time and probably not as strong as someone like Venom in terms of strength, but he's a very smart guy, and I definitely put him up there with the classic Spider-Man villains like your Kingpins, your Green Goblins, and your Venoms, because he's been around a long time, and you know, he's got a very unusual look. I mean, he has a long purple cape, a green suit, and that great big fishbowl for a head. And you know, I've got this issue of Amazing Spider-Man 13, and it's one of my favourites. And this episode pretty much is an adaptation of that comic book. I mean, they did make a couple of little changes here and there, but for the most part, they pretty much stayed true to that comic book. And as I said, this episode is number 3 in my top 10 favourite episodes of Season 1, and it's a classic. I mean, no matter how many versions they've done of this story, it's still great regardless. And what I liked about the show in particular was they took several classic issues of the Spider-Man comic book run from the 60s and adapt it to animation. So I liked that a lot. I thought that was really, really cool. And obviously, to a lot of hardcore geeks out there, Mysterio made his big screen debut back in 2019, where he was played superbly by Jake Gyllenhaal. And you know, that film, Spider-Man Far From Home, is a fantastic Spider-Man film. I highly recommend you check it out. Jake Gyllenhaal was just blowing on all cylinders, and he kicked a lot of ass as Mysterio, and he was absolutely fantastic. And because Far From Home is a great Spider-Man film, I thought it's only fitting that, you know, for the next review of this series, I talk about Mysterio, which just so happens to be featured in one of my favourite episodes, The Menace of Mysterio. And this episode also introduced to a very important character who would go on to become one of Spider-Man's closest friends and allies, and that's Detective Terry Lee. Now, Detective Terry Lee never actually appeared in any comic books. She was created specifically for this series, and she was one of my favourite characters on the show. She was like a female Commissioner Jim Gordon from the Batman comics, where she was the only one who trusted Spider-Man and believed in him when everybody else crapped on him. And even though she didn't always agree with the way Spider-Man handled his business in terms of the villains, she respected him and she knew deep down that he was a good person and he was just trying to do the right thing. So I liked Terry Lee a lot. She was very feisty, very hardcore, no nonsense type of cop, and she didn't take any crap from anyone, even from Peter Parker. And she was a lot of fun, and she went on to play a very big role in the series overall. So anytime there was a crime scene that may have had the police looking the other way, she would bring Spider-Man in to check it out. So I liked that a lot. And one of the other things that I liked about this episode in particular was everybody believed that Spider-Man had turned to a life of crime, but Detective Terry Lee was the only one who stood by him and believed in him that he was framed. So I liked that aspect a lot, and she was definitely a big part of this episode, and one of the main reasons why I enjoyed this a lot. I thought the way they had written Detective Terry Lee for the show was very well done, and I believe they actually introduced Detective Terry Lee into the comic books eventually. I believe she did appear in an issue or two somewhere after she appeared on the show, so she's a really good character. She's kind of like Renee Montoya from the Batman comics, but if Renee Montoya became like the commissioner or something like that. But she was a lot of fun. I really liked her a lot, and as I said, she played a very big role later on, I think, with the Blade crossover episode. She was a big part of that. So yeah, I liked her, Detective Terry Lee. She was one of my favourites, and her and Dr. Connors were, in my opinion, two of Spider-Man's most trusted and closest allies in his fight against crime. So you had Dr. Connors, as I explained in the last video. He was all about the science, about things you had to explain, and you had Detective Terry Lee, who was all about trying to get to the truth. So I like the way both of those characters helped balance out Spider-Man's character. So if there was a crime going on, you have Detective Terry Lee, or if there was a science thing going on, you have Dr. Kurt Connors. So I really enjoyed that a lot, and she's a cool character, real badass. And also, this episode did a great job in establishing the relationship between Detective Terry Lee and Peter Parker. Now, these two meet each other for the first time in this episode when she sees Peter holding Spider-Man's webbing, which was at the scene of the crime where the imposter Spider-Man robbed the museum, and she refers to Peter as Spider-Man's paparazzi. And Peter says to Terry, "Look, just because I take a picture of Spider-Man doesn't mean I know where to find him." And little does she know that Spider-Man and Peter Parker are the same guy, and she very determined to find out that Spider-Man has been framed when she says to him, "Look, I truly believe that Spider-Man's been set up, he's been framed, and this is your big chance to help an innocent man." And Peter, while trying to protect his secret identity, shrugs it off, and Terry responds back with a line that really touches a raw nerve by saying, "All I know is Spider-Man would never turn his back on anybody when they're in trouble," which is exactly what it is you're doing right now. And this is the episode where Spider-Man's origin story is actually addressed, because by this point we're about 5 episodes into season 1, and Spider-Man's origin has never been addressed until this episode. And Spider-Man, as we all know, got bitten by a radioactive spider. But what we see in this flashback is we see Spider-Man started out being a wrestler first, as we all remember, and Peter says to himself, "Well, that is true, she is right. Spider-Man would never turn his back on anyone, except once." And he sees a robber, as we all know, and Spider-Man lets him pass, and the same robber is the one who ends up murdering his Uncle Ben, and it really hits Spider-Man hard. So this was very well done, and I like the fact in the show they didn't do the whole origin episode of Spider-Man, which I think worked out well. I like that they addressed it in a couple of little flashbacks over the course of the show. So in that sense, that worked very, very well overall, because we've seen Spider-Man's origin enough times. We don't need it to be told again and again, but doing it in a couple of flashbacks, it works, and it works very, very well. And another thing that the show did a great job with was Mysterio's backstory. Now, I remember in the comic book, obviously his real name was Quentin Beck, which they've kept in the show. He looked a little bit different to how he looked in this episode. In the comic book, he looked kind of a little bit old. He had short, dark hair, and he was still a special effects guy, but he was more like a petty thief who wanted to get rich very quickly, and he studied all of Spider-Man's moves. He copied Spider-Man's webbing and all sorts of things, even made the costume as well, and he was just out on a one-man mission to ruin Spider-Man. But in this episode, it's a little bit different. He's still the special effects guy, but he wasn't really what you would call a petty thief. We see in a flashback when Spider-Man and Terry Lee are trying to dig up on who Mysterio actually is, and basically what happens is, in this flashback, is they were doing a movie which Quentin Beck was involved in. It was on the Brooklyn Bridge, because there is a line Mysterio says that, "I want to settle the score, but it's got to be the one place where it started it all for me, the very place where you ruined me." And of course that's the Brooklyn Bridge. What happened was Quentin Beck did some special effects for a movie on the Brooklyn Bridge, which got a little bit out of control, and Spider-Man got involved and saved the stunt people from getting hurt, and Quentin Beck was involved, and I think Spider-Man captured him, and Quentin Beck said the line, "This is your fault. I'm going to make you pay for this, Spider-Man. I will get you, I swear." So that, in a way, helped set up his beef with Spider-Man. Maybe not to the degree that Eddie Brock's beef was with Spider-Man, because that played out throughout a number of episodes before he got to go after Spider-Man in a big way as Venom. But I liked that in this episode, unlike the comic book. I mean, I love the comic book. The comic book is great, but what I liked in this episode is that Mysterio and Spider-Man have crossed paths in the past, so that worked out very well. And even though Spider-Man didn't know this at the time, he indirectly helped create Mysterio, so that was really good in that sense. And the beef with it's quite silly, really. Quentin Beck was doing stunts and it got out of control, and Spider-Man obviously went to save the day, and Quentin Beck took that the wrong way, so he went out to frame Spider-Man. So I like how they established the beef with these two, and as we all know, this wouldn't be the last time we see Mysterio. And I like how in this episode, at first, they try to make Mysterio look like a heroic figure, but obviously we all know that he's not really, and did a really good job. I really enjoyed this episode a lot, and the way they established Mysterio as someone who's got serious beef with Spider-Man was very well done. Absolutely loved it. One of the highlights of this episode for me was when Spider-Man learned about how Mysterio creates all these illusions, and it is very different to how they did it in the comic books. With the comic books, it was just nothing more than old-fashioned theatricality, puff of smoke and the Hall of Mirrors and all that sort of thing. But what they did for Mysterio in this episode, which went on to become quite a big thing for him over the course of the show, was he used a thing called the Holocubes. The Holocubes were basically little domino cubes. You'd throw it on the floor like a domino, and it would create all these crazy illusions. And I thought that was a really cool gimmick that they used for Mysterio, because he's a special effects guy, so you can imagine the sort of things he can come up with if he really put his head to it. So I like that they established that in this episode, and I thought it was really fun in this episode that Spider-Man has to save Terry Lee and Jameson, because you've got essentially two complete polar opposites of the characters. You've got Detective Terry Lee, who believes in Spider-Man and stands by him, and you've got Jameson, who absolutely hates Spider-Man and will look for any excuse to make him look bad. I mean, Jameson's not really a villain in that sense, he just doesn't like Spider-Man. So to have Spider-Man be the guy to save two complete polar opposites of characters was a really fun move. And another highlight of this episode for me was you see like thousands of Mysterios standing there holding guns, and you hear Mysterio say, "Which one of us is the real one, Spider-Man? By this point it will be too late." So I thought that was really cool, and I liked how in Spider-Man Far From Home they kind of paid homage to that scene where you see like thousands of Mysterios in the room and Spider-Man's got to try and figure out who's the real one. So I thought that was really, really cool. And Mysterio's voice is very different in the cartoon than he is in the film, because in the film Mysterio's got a very squeaky, high-pitched voice, which works fine, but I like the fact that he's got a very deep voice in this show. So I think I probably prefer in the show, that is, Mysterio's voice than the film, because I remember in the film he's got a very high-pitched voice, which is fine, but in the cartoon he's got a much deeper, softer voice. So yeah, I liked that a lot, and this was a fantastic episode and really cool way to see how Spider-Man cleared his name after capturing Mysterio. So very well done and great episode, I must say, and so far it's number 3 in my favourite episodes of season 1. Number 1 being Venom Saga, number 2 being Night of the Lizard, and number 3 The Menace of Mysterio. So good stuff. And also in this episode we are treated to an appearance by Mary Jane, and this is only the second time we have seen Mary Jane in the show, because she made her debut at the end of the Spider Slayer 2-parter, but prior to that she was mentioned a couple of times from Aunt May about, Peter, you must meet my friend Anna's niece, she's really nice. So they kind of planted the seeds for Mary Jane to make her appearance, and at this point the relationship that we would come to know between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson is not yet established. So these two are just casually, I wouldn't say they're dating, but I would probably say they're just getting to know each other more, and Peter Parker is trying to juggle his social life and his life of crime fighting as Spider-Man, as he's always constantly letting her down. But I thought this episode did a good job planting the seeds for the relationship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, because Mary Jane would go on to play a very, very big role in the show over the course of many seasons. And I think in a way they kind of made Mary Jane the Gwen Stacy of the show, because anybody who's read the comic books would know that the first girlfriend that Spider-Man ever had was Gwen Stacy. But I think Gwen Stacy did appear in one episode. I think that was like towards the end of the show. I think she made a cameo, but they established Mary Jane as more of a Gwen Stacy for Peter Parker, which was fine. I had no issues with it, but it would have been nice to have seen Gwen Stacy come first before Mary Jane, but everything worked out fine, so I've got no complaints whatsoever. And I said, Mary Jane, there would be lots of twists and turns with this character, and we would learn a lot more about her background over the course of the show. But I thought, for the most part, before they did a U-turn and revealed so much about her, I liked how when we first see Mary Jane, she's very carefree and very feisty, and she knows what she wants, and she's no pushover. So every time Peter lets her down, she would say, well, no, I'm not giving you another chance. Why should I? I've given you too many and you keep letting me down. So fantastic job in establishing Mary Jane. So this episode did a good job in not only establishing Mary Jane, but also the beef between Mysterio and Spider-Man, and also the relationship between Detective Terry Lee and Spider-Man. So we got to see more important relationships develop with Spider-Man in this episode. So fantastic. Loved it. Really good. And there you have it, guys. That was my third favourite episode from Spider-Man Season 1, and I've dedicated it to one of my good friends who I know is a big fan of Mysterio, and I know he liked this episode a lot, so I hoped he enjoyed listening to me talking about this episode. And like I said earlier, what I liked about this episode was I liked how they addressed Spider-Man's origin for a couple of flashbacks instead of doing the entire whole origin story in one episode. And the way they do it was, for example, if someone says to Spider-Man, oh, you should have done a lot more than that, it always flashes back to that moment where Spider-Man let the criminal get away, and as a result of that, Uncle Ben was the casualty due to Spider-Man's carelessness. So I like how they always throw the "with great power comes great responsibility" line every so often, each time Spider-Man flashes back to that infamous moment in his early part of his crime fighting career. So really good job there. And I am going to wrap this up now. What's your thoughts on the Menace of Mysterio? Did you think it was good? What did you think of Mysterio as a villain? Did you think they did a good job with the way they wrote him? And what about the beef with Spider-Man and Mysterio? Did you like the idea that they had crossed paths before? You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will be back next time for another edition of the Spider-Man review series, and it's going to be a little bit different. I am going to be talking about 2 episodes in one video, but I won't tell you until I actually put that up, so make sure you don't miss that. So until next time, take care everybody and stay safe.